Good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick note that I will be, due to tech issues, reading out Glenda's script on her behalf. So what follows from now is Glenda's presentation. So I'll take it away. Hi, I'm Glenda Watson Hyatt, a middle-aged white woman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Master's of Applied Science student at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, although I am actually zooming in from Surrey, BC, where I am privileged to live, work, and play on the unceded ancestral territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Simamo peoples. I'm also the president-elect for Isaac Canada, the Canadian chapter of the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. Today, I am sharing persistent gaps in recruiting, hiring, and retaining employees with speech disabilities. Next slide, please. To provide some context on this segment of the disabled population, speech disabilities affect the articulation of sounds, fluency, and/or voice. Some speech disabilities occur early in life, such as with cerebral palsy or autism spectrum disorder, while others are acquired later in life, such as after a stroke or with multiple sclerosis or oral cancers. Next slide. The prevalence of speech disabilities in Canadian adults 15 years old or older is 1.9%. In comparison, nearly 4 times the number of Canadians with developmental disabilities. Admittedly, these statistics are from 2006, 18 years ago. This is because Statistics Canada has not included speech disabilities in the Canadian Survey on Disabilities, or CSD, since 2006. Next slide, please. Turning to the employment inequities experienced by Canadians with disabilities, the most recent data, the CSD 2022, shows that the employment rate for people with disabilities is 62%. However, the rate for people without disabilities is 78%, a gap of 16%. Compare this with the most recent estimates for people with speech disabilities. The most current number we have is over 2 decades old and suggests that people with speech disabilities have an employment rate as low as 14%. There is an urgent need to include speech disabilities in data collection and for new research that can tell us if and how this number has changed over the years. Next slide, please. Both the Employment Equity Act of 1995 and the Accessible Canada Act aim to identify and remove barriers in employment. To comply with the ACA, employers will need to adapt in recruiting, hiring, and promoting these Canadians by January 1st, 2040. Next slide. I think we're a slide behind. Next slide, please. Thank you. This research interviewed 10 employees with speech disabilities to better understand the barriers that have existed and still exist for them within the general labor market. The employment lifecycle framework was used to organize and visualize the findings, which were categorized into 6 components, namely job seekers with speech disabilities, searching, recruiting, interviewing, hiring, and retaining. 3 distinct barriers run through the employment lifecycle: lack of awareness, knowledge, and training, attitudinal barriers, and lastly, legislation, policy, and human rights. Each will be shared here. Let me preface this by saying 20 pages of findings have been boiled down to 15 minutes of highlights or lowlights, as the case may be. Next slide, please. To provide a very brief snapshot of the participants, they used a variety of communication methods, including natural speech, tablets or smartphones, dedicated speech-generating devices, manual signs or gestures, letterboards, and chat apps like Facebook Messenger or virtual platforms like Zoom and Teams. Notably, participants were highly educated, with half of them holding a graduate or professional degree. Their fields of study included social sciences, business administration, and industrial design. Next slide, please. The 6 participants working for an employer were employed in a diverse range of fields, including urban accessibility planning, post-secondary teaching, business, political analysis, and grounds maintenance. Next slide, please. Turning to the search strategies, participants used tools most job seekers would utilize, including networking, direct contacts, specific employer websites, and job platforms. However, Job platforms and recruiters were identified as barriers because they are designed to be exclusionary. In particular, recruiters are gatekeepers to employment, connecting the employer to the job seeker if deemed suitable. But they lack training in assessing capabilities and skills when speech is the disability. Interpersonal communication is essential during the job search process. Yet, for those with speech disabilities, the process becomes even more difficult to navigate. The phone was also identified as a barrier. Participants shared having potential employers hang up on them. Fortunately, newer technologies such as Zoom chat, text, and online forums create opportunities for these job seekers to connect and network online. Most participants shared needing to undertake additional tasks that included self-advocating prior to interviews, educating coworkers about communication access needs, or requesting accommodations. Understandably, job searching with a speech disability is accompanied with emotional and mental health tolls. Next slide, please. In parallel with searching for a job is the employer's efforts to recruit. Employment programs and services can assist these efforts. However, whether mainstream or disability related, they can lack awareness and knowledge of speech disabilities and thus do not provide appropriate resources. Although ample generic resources on hiring people with disabilities are currently available, resources specific to hiring individuals with speech disabilities are sparse. Only 2 resources were identified. The Job Accommodation Network website provides suggestions for employees with speech disabilities. Communication Disabilities Access Canada provides general information on communication disabilities and communication access and information for specific sectors. However, there is no information specific to employers. Participants identified that unions need resources to assist with hiring people with disabilities while navigating antiquated labor laws. Resources specific to augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, and office-based employment are also needed. Next slide, please. Interviews are the main barrier because they rely on face-to-face communication. This necessitates job seekers to communicate with people unfamiliar with their speech patterns and/or preferred communication methods. Experience with interviews is often limited, negative, and emotionally draining. The interviewer's attitude sets the tone, which can become more inclusive by asking everyone what would help you to be successful in your interview. Methods alternative to the traditional interview are needed to evaluate a candidate with a speech disability. Value and evaluate capability over disability. Next slide. The next component in the framework is hiring, which centered around workplace accommodations. Communication-related accommodations were straightforward. For example, job duties did not include phone calls. Online video platforms were used for meetings rather than conference calls. Mainstream technology, like email and instant messaging, was used for internal communication. It should be noted that none of these accommodations are large budget items. However, the cost of requesting accommodation can be substantial to the employee. Such requests could negatively affect perception of eligibility and lead to discrimination. Essentially, requesting accommodations can cost an individual an employment opportunity. Next slide, please. The final component of the framework is retaining employees. Several of the jobs, whether internships, contract positions, part-time, or summer jobs, did not have advancement opportunities. When the position ended, participants were forced to repeat the lengthy and emotionally draining employment life cycle. Disability also impacted job or career mobility. Participants felt stuck in their job because it is hard to get another job as a disabled person. On the other hand, some participants shared their disability helped in getting the position. Their disability was viewed as an asset, particularly when the job was related to accessibility. Next slide, please. The systemic barriers throughout the employment life cycle are best demonstrated by salient and poignant quotes from the participants. Next slide. Participants indicated a resounding need for increased awareness for employers, hiring managers, and society as a whole. One participant shared, quote, "It boils down to realizing that we exist, that we can do the job, and to be patient," end quote. After all, until employers are aware we exist, we can't be included. Next slide, please. Another participant succinctly said, quote, "Hiring managers need to be better trained to hire people with disabilities," end quote. Next slide, please. Regarding attitudinal barriers, one participant shared, quote, "I find a lot of people underestimate me or talk to me like I'm a 3-year-old, which is very disrespectful," end quote. This disrespect and underestimation of abilities was heard repeatedly from our participants. Next slide. Another participant stated, quote, "I must work double as hard to prove my capabilities, and to me, that is a form of ableism. I shouldn't need to prove anything," end quote. Next slide, please. Government programs and services create systemic barriers to employment. One participant explained, quote, "There is an opportunity that I can advance, but I don't want to take it because that would affect the government funding I receive," end quote. She cannot afford to take a promotion, otherwise she would lose her social assistance and medical benefits. Next slide. Human rights boards are meant to provide a remedy when discrimination has occurred. However, as one participant explained, quote, "The fact is that our labor and human rights boards are super underfunded and overworked. You can file complaints, but they can take years. You can't take the company to court because you don't have the money," end quote. These quotes shed light on the reality experienced by this segment of the Canadian population, on the systemic barriers we face on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Next steps, depending upon funding, may include extending this research to learn from employers about what they perceive as barriers in recruiting and hiring employees with speech disabilities. Creating concrete recommendations based on the promising practices identified in this study. Creating employer-focused resources. Publishing in scholarly journals and presenting at conferences such as this one. These findings could also inform future directions for other researchers interested in inclusive employment and speech disabilities. Of course, the priority is better data collection at the government level regarding Canadians with speech disabilities, because that which is not measured does not get included. Next slide. This research was supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and by MyTax. A heartfelt thank you to the participants who generously shared their experiences and insights. Together, we can strengthen the movement to include all, including employees with speech disabilities in the workplace. Thank you.